Happy holidays, everyone! This is Classic Gaming Today, where we talk about the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. As always, I'm your host, Tony, and today is a special episode because it is once again the holiday season, and that means it's time for everyone to receive one of our previously published Patreon-exclusive podcast episodes. This one focused on one of the biggest games of the year, Hollow Knight Silksong. This is just a small taste of the kinds of shows you'll get at our Patreon, so if anyone is interested, definitely check it out at patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. With that out of the way, I hope everyone enjoys this small gift from me to you. Happy holidays, everyone. Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today Expansion Pack, where we take an expanded look into the classic games and technology that continue to shape the gaming experiences we all know and love today. This is our Patreon-exclusive podcast that's meant to build on but not copy the traditional CGT formula. This is where we'll experiment with different kinds of formats and topics that might be a bit beyond the scope of CGT. We may do ranking episodes, we may do list episodes, we may dive into alternate dimensions, we may do a skit-filled homage to Olympic history, or we may look at some modern games and talk about why, for certain ones, I just want to fanboy all over them, which is exactly what we're going to do today, because I simply am declaring that I love Silksong. We're going to talk all about Silksong throughout the rest of this episode. We'll get to that in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com. We have our Discord server, and of course, there is always Patreon. Feel free to reach out in any way you like. I will be there. Before we get to our topic of the day, I thought it'd be a good idea to go a little bit behind the scenes as far as what's been going on around here, because we didn't have a behind the scenes last time for the Patreon episode, because the last Patreon episode was our Olympics episode. Man, let's talk a little bit about the Olympics episode. I will say that while the Olympics episode for me, and I hope, first of all, I hope everybody enjoyed it, because it takes a lot of time. It takes a little bit of effort to get that one out there and to do everything and to edit it all together and make it feel quote unquote real, so to speak. So I hope everybody enjoyed the episode. I will say that looking back on, and this was the second time we did an Olympics episode. They're some of my favorite episodes to do, but they're also some of the more challenging ones to do because it takes a lot of time to make it feel generally normal, so to speak. Normal, but in a very abnormal way, because anybody who's listened to the Olympics episode knows that is a very abnormal set of characters that came together to create the Olympics. So I hope everybody did enjoy it. It did take quite a bit of time, and I do apologize for having to delay it a little bit beyond its original release date. I originally intended to release it not last episode, but the episode before, but then life got in the way, work got in the way, and I knew that in order to do it justice, at least from my own personal perspective, I needed just a little bit more time. So I did delay it a couple weeks. That came out a couple weeks ago. That took a lot of time to put together, but hopefully it was all worth it. The Olympics in general, and back when I did the Olympics last year, I did not necessarily plan on doing an Olympics every single year. It was something where I was trying something out. It was timed with the Summer Olympics back when we originally did them. And I thought, hey, it might be cool to do something with the gaming community, with the CGT community, and try to do something Olympic-like and see how that goes. And I might have mentioned this a year ago, literally. But when I originally did that first Olympics episode, when I first sat down to begin creating that Olympics episode, I didn't know what format I was going to use. I thought at first it was going to be just a very traditional, just talk about the Olympics, talk about what happened, the different games that were there, the different events, the way that everybody competed. And then I had the idea to turn it into a pseudo sports broadcast, and that, well, the rest is history from there. So now we can't do an Olympics. First of all, we have to do an Olympics every year because it's so much fun. It's a lot of work for you guys too, the Olympic period. I can only imagine how much time all of you spent competing in the games just to have a chance at winning or just to take part in the festivities. So kudos to all of you for really going out there and playing all those games and keeping up with the competition over 4 weeks. That is tough. So definitely a lot of work on your end. It's a fair amount of work getting it all set up and getting it all running and making sure I'm monitoring the chats and all the different people that get the submissions and getting the points in the right place and maintaining the leaderboard. And you saw a couple times I even flubbed that up. So thank you to ISO and others who pointed out where I may have kind of done some wrong math or missed something. So I do appreciate all of that assistance. But the Olympics, great time. I can't wait till the Olympics next year. We have to see how we one up ourselves yet again going into next year. So I'm excited about that. Anyway, beyond the Olympics, I have been hard at work getting a number of our future episodes prepared and ready to go. I have been on what I'll call a scripting, what's the word? I'll say I've been on the scripting warpath, so to speak. And as you guys know, I'm not necessarily scripting every single word of our episodes for year 4, but I am trying to lay out all of the different outlines, scripted content where it makes sense to try to get ahead of the game from an overall, what I'll call documentation perspective, because as I'm laying out the rest of the roadmap for the next year, I want to make sure that I'm ready to go. So I have been really heavily focused on scripting because there have been periods of time where I've been away from my recording setup and I kind of just want to record as a batch, so to speak, when I'm ready to record. So I have right now scripted pretty much out through episode 172-ish. Right now, which at the point of this recording, or I guess the point of this release, we will have released episode 159. So I've got a good 12 to 13 episodes ready to record. Some of them have been recorded. So as of the point of this recording, I've recorded up through episode 164-ish. So I've got a pretty good backlog going. I've been trying to maintain the backlog, and I've talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to beat a dead horse, but it's so important to maintain a degree of consistency and also to give yourself some wiggle room when life gets in the way or when you want to play something else. Like as an example, Silksong. Silksong popped up, and for a good week and a half, 2 weeks, that was the only thing I played. You think I was playing other retro games during that time? No. Silksong captured my attention and it wouldn't let it go. So I spent a significant amount of time playing Silksong. The only reason I was able to do that and not feel like I was shirking my responsibilities was because of all the scheduled stuff and everything that I've been working behind the scenes to keep the podcast itself, the main CGT feed, up and running. So just a little, I know I keep saying that, but I know that I also get different comments from different people at different points saying, hey, I'd really like to start a podcast, or I'd like to start a YouTube channel, or I'm trying to get a YouTube channel off the ground and I need to know, can you give me any hints or pointers? And it's not like I maintain a significant YouTube presence today or even in the past when I used to do streaming, but the core concept is the same. Consistency is incredibly important. So I would just encourage anybody who's thinking to do anything creative is be consistent and also give yourself a little bit of flexibility. If things get in the way, make sure that it doesn't derail your entire workflow. So just something to keep in mind. Anyway, just some quick updates as far as upcoming episodes, because we do have some sponsored content coming up. Episode 161 in a couple weeks is going to be Constructor. So Rich, if you hear this, I'm going to be looking for your sponsor message, hopefully within the next week and a half or so. Beyond that, episode 163, that one's going to be Killer Instinct. That's Toucan Sam's sponsored episode. So Toucan Sam, you have a little bit of time, but definitely look at getting your sponsor message in as soon as you can. And then episode 164 is going to be Age of Empires 2. That one is Maximus's sponsored episode. So Maximus or Sean, if you talk to Maximus, let him know we need to get that sponsor message in within the next month or so. Age of Empires 2 is coming out on November 10th. So preferably, just to give an indication of timing, so hopefully the week before that would be ideal to get a sponsor message in for Age of Empires 2. So those are some of the upcoming things that are going to be coming up. Upcoming things coming up. Yes, I speak really well. Anyway, I'm going to be posting the roadmap for episodes 161 through 170 on Discord coming up probably within the next week or so. I usually do 10 episode chunks to post that roadmap out there. So that will be coming, and then we will just go onward and upwards through the rest of year 4 and beyond. I mean, there's never an end in sight when it comes to cool games to talk about, or even some less cool games to talk about, as some of our sponsors are apt to select, specifically Ricky. But anyway, that is pretty much all I wanted to cover behind the scenes. Oh, I guess I should also mention, because it's been a common theme throughout a lot of these recent episodes, work is still work. I'm still working, and it's very work-like. But you know what? It's okay. I've gotten a fairly good balance going on, even with all of the different workshops and meetings and face-to-faces and all that kind of stuff that continues to happen and will likely continue to happen. I think I'm in a good spot right now. And I've got a pretty good setup as far as how I'm keeping up with the podcast, as well as keeping up with personal responsibilities, professional responsibilities, and everything else. So in a fairly good spot right now. And then one final thing, which has absolutely nothing to do with the podcast, but has something to do with something I mentioned a while ago at this point. And some of you may not be interested in this, but a while ago I had mentioned that I was reading Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot series, which I might have butchered that pronunciation. I think that's how you pronounce it, based on listening to other people that know that pronunciation way better than I do. But anyway, I had mentioned before that I was reading a lot of Agatha Christie. I have maintained and continue to read Agatha Christie, and I can now say that I am nearing the end of that entire series. That's been a couple-year effort to read all of the books, and wow, is she a talented writer. If anybody enjoys mysteries and twists and just really good stories, really interesting characters, and actually really engaging dialogue, especially considering that these were all written well over 100 years ago. At least I think they were all written. Most were written 100 years ago or more, and some were not. But regardless, if anybody's interested in some of that, definitely check out Agatha Christie. I mean, wow, she is a great author. Anyway, that is completely irrelevant to the topic at hand, which is why I love Silksong so much. Before we get to that, though, a little bit of history, because as you all know, I love looking at the historical aspects of games, even modern titles. So let's talk about the history of Silksong. To start, we can't just start talking about Silksong as though it sprung into existence just randomly, because it did not. To talk about Silksong and understand where it came from, we have to talk a little bit about its creators, who were Team Cherry. Team Cherry is an Adelaide, Australia development company founded by Ari Gibson, who primarily has been working on art. So both Ari Gibson and William Pellin, who were the two founders of Team Cherry. They've both contributed their respective talents to the games that Team Cherry has created, which really are Hollow Knight and Silksong. Ari Gibson was always focused on art, and he had run, I believe, an animation studio before he had founded Team Cherry. William Pellin has been more involved in game design in general. He worked on several different games before founding Team Cherry alongside Ari Gibson. And eventually, Team Cherry would actually expand to include a third formal member, that being Jack Vine, who is a dedicated software engineer. All three individuals are based in Adelaide, Australia. So this whole story originates from Adelaide, Australia. And I know that we do have some Australian listeners out there. So definitely interesting to hear about some of the Australian development companies, and specifically one Australian development company that is making a name for itself and has made a significant name for itself and a splash in the modern gaming industry. Anyway, that's Team Cherry. 3 people. Ari Gibson, William Pellin, and eventually Jack Vine, who joined during Hollow Knight's development. And that is the company. So as we continue to talk about the creation of both Hollow Knight and Silksong, recognize that for the most part, these games were created by effectively 3 people. Hollow Knight, which is the game that immediately preceded Silksong, didn't begin its life as Hollow Knight. And in fact, it didn't even begin itself as a formal game at all. It wasn't something that Team Cherry assumed they were going to release on the market. Team Cherry, like many software development teams, especially smaller independent ones, were keen on participating in various game jams. And we talked about game jams in a couple episodes of the podcast before, but just to give a little bit of a refresher. A lot of times when you have development teams, you have a couple different styles of how you're going to develop something. You have some companies and some studios, and they're kind of focused on creating games to release to the masses. But then occasionally, you have people that they just want to have some fun and develop something in a very tight timeline with very strict criteria and just challenge themselves to see if they could develop something not necessarily to release to the market, but more so as an internal validation of their own skill set, or just a way to challenge themselves to think about things a little bit differently. And to help these people actually embrace that side of their personality, that side of their overall creativity, there are these things called game jams, which are basically these very short, time-constrained events where it might be a company, it might be an organization, it might just be an online forum, but they organize these game jams. And what happens is usually there is a criteria that's set as the quote-unquote requirements for the game jam. So it might be a game jam to develop, say, a Metroidvania, or a game jam to only use 8-bit colors, or a game jam to create a platformer kind of thing. And then a bunch of different people, whether that's development studios, individual independent developers, or small teams of people that are just creative and want to try their hand at developing something, they'll spend 1 to 2 weeks or whatever the length of the game jam is in order to create something from scratch. Those games that get created oftentimes are just created for that game jam. And you could actually look up game jams, prior game jams on the internet, and a lot of them have demos that are available, or the actual physical product, so to speak, that was created as a result of those game jams. A lot of them are available online. Itch.io has a lot of those kind of things. You just have to know how to search for them. And you can see how some very talented people have created some pretty impressive games under very tight timelines and with very constrained kinds of criteria. A lot of times those game jam projects don't go anywhere. They're simply created for the sake of the game jam, and then the team or the developers or the individuals that worked on those individual projects, they go off and they do other things. The game jam was just a way to challenge themselves and have some fun doing it. Occasionally, though, game jam projects become something more. And that is exactly what happened with the development of Hollow Knight, because Hollow Knight began its life as a game jam project called Hungry Knight, which was created by Ari Gibson and William Pellin back in 2013. They attended a game jam, and I don't know exactly what the criteria was for that game jam, but the end result was Hungry Knight. And if you look at the screenshots from Hungry Knight, and I believe there is a demo of this available. I didn't play the demo, admittedly, but I do believe that there is Hungry Night, you can actually play and see how Hollow Knight began its existence. And it did, in fact, star the protagonist from Hollow Knight. If you look at the screenshots or you play the demo that's out there, you can see very clearly that even back in 2013, Gibson and Pellin had the idea that would eventually morph into Hollow Knight. The graphics and the protagonist himself, I mean, you could see the very stylistic portrayal of these bugs, which is what Hollow Knight's all about. It's all about bugs in a large environment. But you could see how the protagonist is, in fact, the protagonist from Hollow Knight, right down to the way the horns on his head laid. It's very clear the style was in place even from this early on. The graphics were a little bit simpler than what we would eventually get with Hollow Knight, but you could see that they are all very clearly in the same Hollow Knight vein. That game jam concept would eventually, of course, be expanded to create the entire concept, the entire game that would eventually become Hollow Knight. As far as creating Hollow Knight itself, Team Cherry took inspiration from a bunch of classic NES titles, which is fairly traditional when you talk about a lot of games that are created by the 40-somethings that are now prevalent across the gaming industry, especially in the independent game scene. Most of it, and I'm a 40-something guy right now, most of us grew up playing classic NES titles, 8 and 16-bit even titles on the Super NES and other consoles. So it stands to reason that if we want to recapture that feeling from our youth, we're going to go back to those classic titles that we may have experienced and have nostalgia for. In the case of Team Cherry, there was a lot of focus on Metroid, obviously, because Hollow Knight would become a Metroidvania, Zelda 2, and Faxanadu. Faxanadu is a game, by the way, that I definitely want to go back and play. That was a game that I played in a limited capacity back when I was younger, but I definitely want to go back and re-explore that. Zelda 2, interestingly, is going to become a future episode of the Year 4 podcast. So definitely some interesting inspirational choices, but I can certainly see how that inspiration would lead to the development of Hollow Knight. Now, like I mentioned, Team Cherry is a very small studio. At this point, they had 2, maybe 3 people on their team. And when you think about the amount of effort required to develop something, especially something that would be on the scale of what Hollow Knight would eventually become, you might need a little bit of additional help. So the team opened up a Kickstarter, and the goal was to raise some additional funding to expand the overall scope of their game and to get a little bit of help as far as continuing to build out the various aspects of the title, most prominently music, because Ari Gibson, William Pellin, and Jack Vine, none of them were musicians, and they knew that they wanted to include music in the game. So they opened up a Kickstarter and ended up raising 57,000 Australian dollars, which is equivalent to approximately $38,000 in United States currency, just for anybody who might be aware. And they used that funding primarily to bring on a composer to work on the game's soundtrack. That individual was Christopher Larkin. He actually had a fair number of film credits. He's worked on other games before. This was an opportunity for Larkin to contribute his talents to a brand new game that an independent developer was creating. Started to get a little bit of hype, but Hollow Knight, before it was released, wasn't necessarily thought of as this big bang kind of release. It was certainly some interest was developing around it, but this wasn't being looked at as, oh my, this is going to be a significant release in gaming history. Well, it turns out that that's exactly what Hollow Knight would become, because it would come out in 2017 on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, and it would be a significant success. It would end up spawning 4 free expansion packs and would eventually be released across all major console platforms around a year later in 2018. And the game, upon its release, would immediately gain a large fan base. Over the next 7 years, it would sell over 15 million copies. That is an astronomical number for an independently developed game. And when you think about the fact that at the end of the day, the majority of Hollow Knight was created by 4 people, 3 people that were core parts of Team Cherry and Christopher Larkin, who effectively became their composer. 4 people in the 21st century created a game that would sell 15 million copies. And, oh, by the way, they released it for a ridiculously low amount of money. I believe it was $15 when it first came out. Absolutely insane, especially when you consider the amount of content that went into Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight was not a 4-hour game. It was not a 10-hour game. It was like a 60-plus hour game if you include all the expansions and you do all the challenges. It was significant. And the fact that a small team was able to get that much publicity, was able to get that much popularity, and was able to create a game that truly did resonate with the game playing public, that is amazing. Kudos to Team Cherry on an excellent release with Hollow Knight. And just for everybody's awareness, I did play Hollow Knight. I 100%ed it back when it first came out on the Switch in 2018, and I absolutely loved it. Interestingly, though, even before Hollow Knight's first release in 2017, work was underway on a different expansion. So Team Cherry always knew that they wanted to expand the original game. They had planned out several free expansions for the title. They were also hard at work on another expansion, and this was one that they didn't really talk about all that much at the time. This expansion was going to be a bit more detailed, a bit more in-depth and expansive than the other 4 free DLCs that Team Cherry was already planning to release. The thing with this other expansion is that rather than simply expand the world or give additional bosses to fight, this other expansion was going to change the way the game played entirely, because rather than controlling the main protagonist of Hollow Knight, this new expansion was going to focus a shift. You were going to be able to control Hornet, who was another side character from Hollow Knight that crossed paths with the protagonist from Hollow Knight. I can't remember, I don't know what they refer to him as. I probably should have looked that up, because it's not Hollow Knight. That's not his name. But whoever he was, the protagonist from Hollow Knight, he would cross paths with Hornet throughout the game Hollow Knight. And this expansion that Team Cherry began to work on was going to be focused on Hornet. You would actually have a chance to control Hornet within this environment. And the thought was that Hornet would play dramatically different than the main character from Hollow Knight. She was faster. She was more adept physically. She had better combat abilities, or different combat abilities. She moved around the combat and the battlefield a lot differently than what your normal protagonist did. So the thought was, this is going to be a major change of pace when you get a chance to control Hornet. And the intention was to release this as an expansion to the original Hollow Knight game. The thing is, though, as work continued to progress, Team Cherry realized that this expansion, this Hornet-focused expansion, was getting just a bit too big. So instead, they decided, rather than release this as a gargantuan expansion that may in fact never come out, they decided to turn it into a full-fledged sequel to Hollow Knight. And that sequel would eventually, many years later, release as Silksong. So let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at the timeline. Hollow Knight came out in 2017. Before Hollow Knight even released, work on what would eventually become Silksong was underway. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, that 2017 is when work on Silksong effectively began. The game wouldn't be announced to the public until February 2019. So let's say 2-ish years of development, which in and of itself is pretty standard. So it's not hard to fathom how you might start development on something and then a couple years later, you would announce it to the public as something that's coming soon. And I use the term soon in quotes. And in fact, the first playable demo for Silksong was all the way back in 2019, back when they used to have the E3 or Electronics Entertainment Expo, which sadly no longer exists. But back when E3 was still a thing, the first playable demo for Silksong was available. That was out there in 2019. And then after that demo, there wasn't all that much talked about related to Silksong. There was a little bit of a drip feed of updates that would happen after that. Every now and then there'd be a drop out on Twitter where one of the developers, either Ari Gibson or somebody from Team Cherry, would go out and say, "We're working on it. It's still coming along." And then there'd be other times where there'd be a little preview in a magazine. It's like, "Oh yeah, Silksong, it's still coming. It just have patience. It'll be there." And other times there would just be radio silence. For years, people wondered if Silksong was ever going to actually release. Would it actually release, or would it become vaporware? Team Cherry, for its part, continued to say that yes, Silksong is coming. You just have to wait a little bit longer. Whatever a little bit in this context is. But basically, they would just keep saying, "We're still working on it. It's coming. Just, you gotta wait." Fans, as you might expect, were pretty skeptical. And for a lot of people, there was true concern about whether Silksong would ever see the light of day. And then, just earlier this year, Silksong would make a splash during the Nintendo Direct focused on the Switch 2, which announced that Silksong would finally release later in the year. And then, on August 21st, Team Cherry released a special announcement declaring that Silksong would be releasing in just 2 weeks on September 4th. And it would only be slightly more expensive than Hollow Knight. It was going to cost $20, an insane value proposition if Silksong could maintain the level of quality and expansiveness that Hollow Knight was known for. This is a game that had a fervent fan base and years of built-up demand. And for the most part, other developers, especially independent studios, decided after hearing that Silksong was going to release on September 4th, they decided that trying to go toe-to-toe with Silksong's release date was probably not going to end well for them. So in a move that I haven't really heard about happening all that often, even with AAA kind of releases, a lot of the development teams that had planned to release their games on September 4th or around September 4th, with less than 2 weeks to go until their own launch, because remember, Silksong was basically a shadow drop, so to speak. There was no inclination that it was going to have a specific date. 2 weeks, and it declares it's coming out September 4th. A lot of these development studios and publishers, they didn't have a ton of time to react. But even with that lack of time, a lot of them decided to reschedule their own game releases. They needed to get out of the way of Silksong's impending launch because they figured Silksong was going to dominate. And a lot of these companies, especially the more independent studios, they didn't want their games to get completely swept under the rug because Silksong was going to have all of the attention of the gaming community. Some developers, however, didn't. They decided that they were going to just let it ride on that September 4th release date, either because they were already tied to a major publisher and therefore felt impervious to a small team's release because Team Cherry, once again, like 3-ish people, maybe 4, a little bit of auxiliary staff too to touch up some things, but really it is effectively a 4-person team. But there were also some developers that were just like, I'm not going to change my release date. Why would I do that? It does. Well, my game will stand on its own. It doesn't matter. And they kind of took the mantra from Bubsy 3D. I think a lot of them were just sitting in meetings and they were like, what could possibly go wrong? Well, regardless of what any of those devs were actually thinking, Silksong did release on September 4th in 2025. And in the process, it would break the internet. No, seriously, it broke the internet. Or at least it broke any storefront that had the privilege of carrying the title. And I'm talking about Steam, GOG, the PlayStation Store, the Xbox Marketplace, and Nintendo Switch Online. Every single storefront, and arguably those are the storefronts for digital distribution, every single one of them crashed under the weight of Silksong's release, with literally millions of gamers attempting to buy and play the game at the same time. I don't recall this really happening for major AAA kinds of releases, but it did for Team Cherry and Silksong, effectively a 4-person team between Gibson, Pellin, Vine, and Larkin. And of course, like I mentioned, some auxiliary staff just to do some miscellaneous odds and ends. 4 people brought a game to life in 2025 that brought down every single major digital distribution video game storefront in the world. Think about that for a second. It is absolutely insane. It's probably not a surprise, but Silksong, despite just releasing around a month ago at the point of this recording, was a success, with universal critical acclaim, millions of copies sold, even more millions of copies played quote-unquote for free via Xbox Game Pass, and in the process, it would delight countless returning and new fans of what can now be called the Hollow Knight franchise. At the same time, though, Silksong would stir up some controversy, especially around the difficulty of the game, which we actually talked about a few weeks ago during our episode on difficulty in gaming. We're going to touch upon the difficulty of Silksong here as well in just a little bit, but suffice it to say, despite any critiques that individuals may have levied against the game, with the most prominent one being the difficulty of the overall experience, Silksong is undoubtedly one of the top releases of 2025. Interestingly, though, Silksong would also gain just a little bit of notoriety from other independent developers, especially those studios who decided to not change their launch date to get out of the way of the train that was so very obviously coming towards them. Those developers complained that Team Cherry giving the equivalent of a 2 weeks notice was an unsavory business tactic and was inconsiderate of other smaller development teams. Smaller as in smaller than the 4 people that primarily made Silksong? I mean, look, I get it. Releasing something that you spend a ton of time and effort on and having it be completely overshadowed by something else has to feel demoralizing. That said, I personally don't believe Team Cherry did anything wrong. And the fact is, from a pure business and strategy perspective, they created a degree of instantaneous hype that very few game companies can generate. It wasn't unfair to other development teams. It was simply the best possible thing Team Cherry could do for Team Cherry. And I would argue that they more than earned that right, given their work on Hollow Knight, back when they were a much more unknown studio, just like many of the independent developers who complained about Silksong's surprise release date announcement just earlier this year. Even beyond that, though, there's been even more controversy appearing after the release of the game, with other independent developers questioning whether they can now possibly charge $20 for their game when it might be a much smaller and less well-designed experience than Silksong. To that, I would say, yes, charge what you think your game is worth. I would personally argue that Team Cherry is either very good or very poor at math, one or the other. Because either they realize that pricing Silksong so low in comparison to the content included in the game will generate such enormous sales that the number of additional copies sold will outweigh the benefit of pricing the game higher. Or they don't understand that the amount of content included here is so much more expansive and well-designed than most AAA $70 releases that they probably could have priced this significantly higher and nobody would have batted an eye. If that's the case, I would suggest that maybe they augment their staff by just one and add an accountant to their small, incredibly talented team. Of course, I am joking because I think that Team Cherry releasing Silksong at such an approachable and accessible price point is absolutely phenomenal for gamers everywhere. And I applaud their efforts in doing that and maintaining their overall vision and still releasing a game as expansive as Silksong at that price point. But regardless, if you haven't played the game, obviously I have, and I know there are other people on Discord that have played the game. We have other members of the community that are actively playing Silksong. But if you haven't played the game, you might be wondering, is all of this attention worth it? Is Silksong really that great of a game? Well, I personally 100% completed the title a couple weeks ago, and I can safely say the answer to that question is a resounding yes. Because the simple fact is, I love Silksong. what is it specifically that I love about Silksong? Well, everything. That's it. Episode over. We're done. No, I'm teasing. Of course I'm teasing. No, but the fact is that Silksong presents one of the most put together, well-designed gaming experiences that I have had in a really long time. It demonstrates a level of expertise from both the game design, overall development, musical, graphical, gameplay, and everything else perspective that I truly am in love with the game. So let's talk a little bit about Silksong and why I love it so much. First of all, I thought it'd be a good idea to give just a little bit of an overview because even though Silksong is incredibly popular, and as of the point of this recording, I believe it just surpassed the 6 million copies sold mark, which is just around a month's worth of sales. And when you look at Hollow Knight, which sold 15 million copies over the course of the last, 8-ish years? Silksong's off to a pretty good start. Of course, now they have a built-in fan base from Hollow Knight to have Silksong benefit from, but regardless, Silksong is a Metroidvania. And what does that mean? Well, there's a couple of different topics or a couple of different features of Metroidvanias that are fairly traditional across most of the genre. As an example, Metroidvanias are oftentimes focused on exploration. You're going to have a large interconnected world to explore, but you're not going to be able to explore that world right off the bat. You'll be able to get to certain areas of the game, but other areas might be blocked off because you don't have the prerequisite skill or ability, or you don't have an item that you might need to unlock a certain area of the world. In this way, the exploration element of Metroidvanias oftentimes include a little bit of a go-back kind of situation. There's a little bit of a situation where you're going to have to go through areas that you've previously traversed before because once you gain a new skill, like a double jump as an example, which will allow you to get higher or jump higher in certain areas, and there might have been a platform on a certain screen where you know there's something up there, but you can't quite reach it with your base skill set. Well, maybe you acquire a double jump and you think, hey, now I can get to that new platform. So you go back, you jump up there, and you find an entirely new stage or level or world area to explore. This is the kind of thing that I would say that arguably that is the defining characteristic for the most part of Metroidvanias, where you have a huge area to explore, you find new items that enable you to explore other areas that might be interconnected, or shortcuts you might find that tie between different areas that you would have never thought existed, all that kind of stuff. That core aspect of exploration gated by some sort of progress, whether that's skills, items, overall experience, whatever the case might be, that is one of the defining characteristics of the Metroidvania. Of course, there are other aspects as well that different games might play around with, like a full equipment system or a pseudo RPG kind of system. We saw that with Castlevania Symphony of the Night a bit, where Castlevania merged with some of the RPG elements to create a truly standout Metroidvania experience. You might have situations where beyond equipment and items, you have a full spell system. Symphony of the Night played around with that one too, but I didn't really get too far into the spell system in that game. But there are other games that use a lot of spells and things like that. Oftentimes, Metroidvanias have a fairly complex mapping system where if you're exploring the world, you need to kind of know where you are. So a lot of Metroidvanias will have maps that will help you navigate that world. There's a ton of different things that go into Metroidvanias, but if I were to characterize it in one kind of way, it would be that sense of exploration, albeit with gated progress. So that's a traditional Metroidvania. Oh, and of course, Metroidvanias oftentimes have bosses that you need to fight, different areas that might be themed differently, or biomes, or different areas of the world that are going to feel very different from each other. Symphony of the Night played around with that concept, albeit within the confines of a castle. There are other Metroidvanias where you might be, and even looking at a game like Metroid, you might be going through a lava area, or a water area, or a technology kind of inspired area, or an alien area. Not necessarily different worlds or different levels, but within the interconnected world, different themes might exist. And oftentimes with Metroidvanias, you have a fairly strong protagonist that will navigate that world and defeat any number of enemies as you acquire new skills, new weapons, new abilities that will enable you to continue to play the game. So that's the core concept of a Metroidvania. And Silksong is probably one of the best examples of a Metroidvania done right, especially with all, or at least most, modern amenities built into the game. It is a phenomenal experience. So let's start talking about why I love Silksong so much. And we're going to start by talking about the overall world design of the game. I just mentioned that one of the, if not the, core characteristic of a Metroidvania is a large interconnected world that you can explore at your leisure, but you might have certain areas blocked off because of your overall progress in the game. Silksong does this impeccably well. You start out in a very small section of the world. Eventually, you find your way to a town. Not too far into the game, you find your way into a town. And at that point, you start thinking to yourself, I wonder how big this world is going to be. And I will admit that when I first started playing Silksong, I remember reading different forum posts and subreddit posts that suggested, and I knew that Silksong was originally designed to be an expansion to Hollow Knight. So I assumed that Silksong might be smaller than Hollow Knight, or at least comparably sized, because I figured, hey, if it started out as an expansion, sure, even though it's been developed for literally 6-7 years at this point, I assumed it was going to be around the same size, or maybe a little bit smaller. And as you're exploring the game, world, and you're unlocking different abilities and getting to new areas of the game world, you start to see your map fill out. Now, interestingly about the map in this game, and this is something that bears mentioning, the map in Silksong, just like Hollow Knight, is not necessarily readily available to you without you having to jump through some hoops. So in Silksong, you actually have to buy maps of the different sections and areas of the game. And as you buy those maps, the map that you're actually able to see in the game will start fleshing itself out. So it's one of those things where the game does not automatically give you progress. And even beyond that, the game does not automatically show you areas that you've been, even if you've bought the map for a given area. You have to have acquired a quill. A quill will let you actually draw, so to speak, the map that you've been to. And you can't even necessarily see yourself on the map as you're navigating the game world. You have to equip a compass in one of your charm slots if you want to actually see where you are on the minimap within the game world. This is something that I will admit I have a little bit of a mixed thought about, because the compass, just as an example, first of all, buying the maps in order to learn about the overall area that you're in, or to see that area and actually be able to map it out, buying the maps from the individual who has the maps. I'm not going to do too many spoilers here because I want to keep it completely or as spoiler free as possible for anybody who might be playing the game. But you buy the map, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with not being able to see where you are in a given area until you buy the map for the area. I will admit that there was a little bit of frustration in some areas where the map guy might not be exactly where you would expect, or might not be in a very easily accessible area. So there were certain areas of the game as I was exploring that I did not have a map for a fairly long period of time. And I will say that it's a little touch and go there. I am not the most, I'm not the most navigationally I'm navigationally challenged. Let's just say that. Even in the real world, I rely on my GPS. I love Google Maps. I love being able to put something in the map and say, okay, go. And then I listen to the quiet, serene sounds of the Google voice tell me exactly where to go. And then I get there, which is awesome, because if I didn't have that, I oftentimes would not get where I was going. So I love GPS. So I am not the most navigationally sound navigator in anything, let alone video games. So having to buy a map, or not having a map for a given area as you're first exploring it, can be a little bit of a challenge, but honestly not all that huge of a deal. What I will say is a little bit of a bigger deal from my perspective is the fact that the compass, the thing that enables you to actually see where you are on that minimap once you've bought the map for the area and you have the quill, which lets you build out areas of the map that might not be on that original map, because certain areas of the game world will have, actually every area of the game world will have hidden secrets and chambers and different things to find, and sometimes entirely different zones to discover. So that's really cool, the exploration aspect. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the fact is that with the maps, you don't always get everything for a given area. You have to uncover that by exploring yourself. If you have the quill, it will build out your map over time. That's awesome. But not having the compass equipped in my charm slots, it's like a non-starter. I can't not have the compass because I absolutely need the compass in order to know where the heck I am. That is the key way that I navigate in the game. I need to be able to see where I am. Now, of course, over time, as you continue to play the game, you will learn the zones, you'll learn the world, you'll know where to go without having to constantly look at the map. But until then, you absolutely need it. At least for me, I absolutely need the compass. So to gate that, or to kind of put it in a situation where you have to give up another charm in order to equip that compass, I will say is, I guess, an interesting design decision. I'm not sure that I love that particular design decision, but if I take that off to the side, because the fact is I played the entire game with my compass equipped, except for certain sections where I would get a new how can I put this without doing spoilers? I get a new ability to have a different loadout for my character. And then when you get one of those new loadout types of things, you will be unequipped. All the charms that you have will be unequipped. So you have to find your way back to a bench, which is like this game's bonfire if you're into Souls-likes, or Stakes of Marika, or is it Stakes of Marika? Or those are the things that make you respawn in Elden Ring. No, Sites of Grace in Elden Ring. It's that mechanic where once you check in at a bench, you will basically have your progress pseudo-saved, so to speak. It's not quite as Souls-like from that perspective because you don't really lose experience when you die in Silksong, though you do lose all of the rosaries that you've acquired, which is effectively this game's currency. Anyway, so when you're exploring the game, I had to use the compass, or I wanted to use the compass the entire time, and because of how large the world is, I would venture a guess that most people are the same way, because the world is huge. There are so many interconnecting paths. There's so many areas of the game that are not depicted on maps. Like I mentioned earlier, there are entire zones in the game that you can't even see on a map, and you might need to break a wall in order to find. There's at least, how many? I'm trying to count up now. There's at least 3, 4. There's a good handful of zones that don't have maps associated with them, and they're just there. And they're not huge, but they do hide hidden secrets. They do hide hidden bosses. They hide hidden pieces of lore. There's so much here to unpack and uncover, and I love exploring a game. This is kind of, I know it's not technically an open world kind of experience, but it kind of is. I'll say it's an interconnected world kind of experience, because it's not like you have individual stages. You can go anywhere in the game at any point, assuming that you've unlocked the ability or the overall way to get to that overall area. And luckily, across the world, there are different fast travel kinds of hot spots where you can go to, and you can either ride a bug to different areas, or in a certain section of the game, you can ride these little elevator chute kind of things to different areas of the world. So there are different ways you can fast travel. But as far as the overall exploration of the world, a lot of that's being done on foot. And it's a good thing that the world is as well designed as it is, because you're going to be seeing these areas of the world so much. I loved uncovering a different area that I didn't know existed, or knocking down a wall and finding a secret there. And I especially loved wandering around and randomly finding a new area to explore. This world is designed so well. Silksong's world feels lived in. It feels inhabited. It feels as though there are real stakes around that world. And I will tell you that by the time I reached what I didn't even realize was the end of Act 1, I thought, this is a gigantic world. This is so cool. This was such a cool game. And then I beat Act 1 and I got to Act 2 and I recognized I hadn't seen anything yet. That was the biggest shocker for me from a world perspective, where you're playing this game and you're feeling like, oh, this is pretty big. It's a pretty big game. And then you unlock an entirely new area, which on the main map is just like this blob. It's this one section of the map, and then you can zoom in deeper, and you see that one section actually has, I don't know, 8-ish subzones, something like that, 6 to 8 subzones maybe. I don't know the exact count off the top of my head. And each of those subzones are developed really well and super deep, and it's gigantic. And as I backed away, as I zoomed out from the map and looked at all the places that I'd explored by the time I got to the end of the game, wow, what an experience. What a world. I loved it. I loved everything about that world design. The good thing is, too, that as you're moving around that world, you also have some really engaging gameplay. And I loved the gameplay in Silksong, even though when you first start playing the game, you have a diagonal pogo kind of thing. And that got a little bit of controversy within the various gaming circles talking about the game. And I will say that even for myself, when I started to try to pogo off of enemies, which basically means jumping up and then trying to attack down to bounce higher or to bounce around, and there are different environmental features in the game that you have to bounce around to navigate the game world. There's some platforming kinds of sections. When I first started playing, I would try to do the pogo, and the way that Silksong's default pogo ability is set up is that you don't pogo straight down like you might see in many other games. You actually pogo diagonally to the side, and it's kind of like a 45-ish degree angle, I guess. And when I first started playing the game, this was a brain melter for me. I could not figure out the right distance, the right time to do the pogo, because it's not like it's a continuous move. Like if you jumped up really high and you did your downward pogo, your diagonal pogo, it's not like you would go down continuously. There's a very limited window of where you're actually progressing down as your pogo ability with your attack so that you can actually bounce. And then after that time lapses, you're just falling. You're not able to pogo off or anything because you've used your pogo skill. You might have missed what you were trying to hit, and then you're just falling and flailing and potentially landing in spikes or other enemies or whatever. And it took a lot of getting used to. Eventually I did get used to the pogo ability, but then of course I unlocked a different loadout ability, which gave me a different pogo, which I loved even more, and I ended up using that throughout the rest of the game, which it is cool that you have these different abilities that are built into some of these loadout items. They're called crests. I guess that's not really a spoiler. They're called crests in the game, and basically the way crests work is that each crest has a different number of charm slots that you can equip, and the different charms within the game, they're color-coded. So a certain crest might have 3 red charm slots, which you can think of almost as like more direct damaging kinds of abilities. And they might have 1 blue, I think it is, and 1 yellow. So less on the utility, more on the direct damage kind of front. Or you might have another crest that has 3 yellow charm slots, and maybe 1 red, and these are just hypothetical examples, but just to paint the picture. You might have 3 yellows and 2 blues and 1 red, which means that crest isn't really used for direct damage. That's more of a utility kind of crest. And then you also have your silk abilities, which some crests can support, some crests cannot. And those silk abilities are special abilities that have some sort of attack that are oftentimes a little bit higher damaging or a little bit more impactful from an overall enemy perspective. Some of them have area effect kind of abilities. So there's a lot of different things that go into that. But one of the cool features of crests that I didn't realize existed when I first started playing the game is that they also change your default moveset. Just the fact that you swing your needle back and forth, it changes the way you swing your needle, and the needle in this case is like a sword. So the way you swing your needle, the way you pogo, the way you move around the environment changes when you change the crest that you have equipped, which I thought was a great touch and a really interesting nuance to the overall gameplay, because it's not like playing through the game, you're going to have a singular experience regardless of who you're playing as or what crest you're using. Different people playing the game might gravitate towards one crest over another, which is going to change their overall gameplay experience, making a level of depth here that I really did not expect. Now, it doesn't really go down the realm of RPG kind of thing, because it's not like you unlock new skill trees or abilities or anything like that, but depending on what your loadout is, it will dramatically affect how you play the game. I know that my preferred loadout is probably not the same as somebody else's preferred loadout, and that is okay. The gameplay is deep enough that it supports multiple different styles of gaming to really create an experience that you can tailor for yourself based on your own skill set and your own preferences, which is awesome. That gameplay goes directly into our next topic, which is the difficulty of the game. We talked about difficulty a little bit for Silksong during our episode on difficulty in gaming. And at the time, I had mentioned that Silksong was going through a little bit of a controversial period because a lot of people were claiming that Silksong was way too difficult. And the biggest complaint was that as you're wandering around the world in Silksong, first of all, just like Hollow Knight, you start with a certain amount of life. I think you start with 5 hit points in Silksong. And as you play the game, you can find additional items which will increase the number of hit points that you have. Very similar to the Legend of Zelda series, where if you find different pieces of hearts, you can increase your overall hit points. But when you first start playing the game, you have 5 total hit points. And in the early going of the game, you're not going to really be increasing that 5 hit point amount to any great degree. That doesn't happen until much, much later in your game. So as you're first starting to play the game, you have these 5 hit points. And as you're navigating the game world, which like I mentioned before, is really well designed, and all of the enemies, by the way, I didn't mention this, but the enemies that inhabit the game world are all so unique and varied and feel so awesome to encounter and to face and to play against that it is just a really, really, really cool experience. But anyway, as it relates to difficulty, those enemies that you encounter, a number of what I would consider to be quote unquote trash enemies will do 2 hit points worth of damage if you were to come into contact with them or if they hit you with certain attacks. Similarly, bosses, a lot of bosses will do 2 hit points worth of damage. Now, it doesn't take much in the way of math skills to realize that that basically means that you could potentially, in certain fights, get hit 3 times and then you're done. You're going to die. You have to go back and reset and run back to wherever you were to continue playing the game. So there is that. Oh, and by the way, I didn't mention this, but there is kind of that Souls-like component where you have to get back to where you were. And if you can get back to where you were, you can recover the overall rosaries that you had dropped. So it's not experience in this one, but it is rosaries. Sorry, I'm a little bit all over the map with this one because I just love the game so much. I just like talking about it. Anyway, we're having the fights. You're having fights, and enemies might do 2 hit points worth of damage, which in the early goings can make things really difficult. And especially because you're not going to be able to increase your hit points for some time as you start playing the game. There was a lot of pushback from gamers that said this is way too difficult. Why would you have these early game areas filled with these early game enemies and have them do 2 hit points worth of damage? And yes, I will say that when I first started playing Silksong, I was getting kind of hammered a little bit. It definitely takes some time to get used to, and the overall way you play the game, while Hornet as a character, that's the character you play in Silksong, while Hornet as a character has a very varied moveset and can move around the world really well, it still takes some getting used to because with all those tools that you'll eventually have at your disposal, the world is made that much more dangerous. And sometimes even environmental damage can do 2 hit points worth of damage. This is not what I would consider to be an easy game. And the fact is, it is difficult. I mean, it is a difficult experience. Once you get used to it, that difficulty is mostly mitigated because you've now gotten used to playing the game. You have the skills that you need in order to actually beat the game or at least play the game effectively, and you can go off and do. The one aspect of this that I will say I have a little bit of an issue with, and we talked about this during our episode on difficulty in gaming, is that the level of difficulty here might make it so that people who would otherwise play the game will not play the game. And I have a perfect example. I'm playing Silksong. When I'm playing Silksong on our big TV in the family room, and my wife might be sitting in the room. And every now and then she'll look up at the screen and she'll think, oh, that looks really cool. That looks like a cool game. And early on in the game, because there wasn't really that much frustration, it was difficult, but it wasn't bad. I was playing the game and she was like, I think I may actually want to play this game. And I've mentioned before that my wife is not a huge gamer, but when she finds something that she likes, she really likes it. So I was really excited. I'm like, hey, yeah, you want the controller now? I always look for opportunities for anybody in my family to get engaged with the whole gaming thing that I absolutely love. So when she said that, I was like, well, I can stop playing. I'll sit, I'll watch you. Here, you want the controller? Here, I'll start up a new profile for you. And she said, no, let me keep watching. I'm interested, I'm curious, but I want to see how it all plays out. So then I got a little bit later into the game and it starts ramping up the difficulty. And as she started seeing some of the fights that I was in and some of the boss fights and some of the amount of times that I had to repeat certain fights, she said, Thanks, but no thanks. That wasn't for her because the difficulty was just too high. Not that she couldn't do it, because I'm sure she could if given enough practice. But my wife is the kind of person that plays games to relax, to dissociate from the real world and to not really have to think too hard. She wants to sit down and play a game that's very casual, and not necessarily casual, because games like Diablo, I would say they're not really casual, but you can tailor the difficulty based on what you want to do. If you want to be challenged, you bump up the difficulty. If you don't, you set it down and you just play the game and you do some mindless killing of a bunch of demonic entities. In Hollow Knight and Silksong, by extension, there really isn't any way to set difficulty. So when you're playing the game, you're going to play the game the developer intended, which is great, unless you don't want to be challenged quite that much. I love the challenge. I love challenging myself in all sorts of games. So even though I may get frustrated at certain points, I still want to play the game, especially if it's a really good game. But my wife, no, it turned her off, and she has not tried it. She hasn't tried it. I don't think she is going to try it because she looks at it and she thinks, oh, that's going to be way too hard. So while I commend the game for its design, and while I don't personally think the difficulty at the end of the day is that huge of a deal because you can overcome it with enough practice, there is some frustration there, and there are some frustrating elements. From my perspective, the biggest derailer, and this isn't really a difficulty thing, but the biggest, I'll say, irritation associated with the quote-unquote difficulty of the game is the run back mechanic to get back to wherever you were fighting. Now, I don't mind a run back. When I used to play EverQuest, the original EverQuest, the concept of a corpse run was there, where you would literally leave all of your equipment on the ground and you would have to somehow find a way to get your corpse with all that equipment in order to actually re-equip your character. It was not uncommon to actually have multiple equipment sets because you might lose or you might die with all of your really powerful stuff on, but trying to get deep into a zone to try to get your equipment back, if you didn't have a necromancer nearby to summon your corpse, oh man, wasn't going to happen. Oh, I love EverQuest. Man, that's another one I love. Anyway, in Silksong, there's a run back mechanic as well. It's not like you lose any power when you have to run back, but you do lose time. And some of the run backs to areas that you would otherwise be exploring and might have died in, or a boss you might have been fighting and then died in, or died during, the run backs, some of them can be a little long. And I know that this is partially being spoiled by games like Elden Ring, where oftentimes they have the stakes of Marika right outside of a boss arena, so that when you want to get back to that boss fight, you literally just respawn right there, go right back in, and you keep playing against that boss. There is one particular run back that I'm thinking of that I will not spoil, but it is in a late game area, and it's a poison swamp area, which I would say probably is right up there with icy levels as far as my overall dislike for the poison swamp. I mean, poison swamps can be okay, but way better than ice physics in most games. But the poison swamp feels like it is one of those most used cliches in these kind of games, whether you're talking about Metroidvanias or Soul-likes or whatever. You always have the swamp-based level or the poison swamp-based level. And there is this one poison swamp level in the game. And until you find a secret location, which actually makes the run back a little bit less onerous, you're going to have a really tough time at this one section of the game. And the boss fight itself that you're trying to get through, it's not horrible once you get used to it and once you learn the best places to stand and the best times to attack and all that kind of stuff. But until you do that, you're going to fight a boss, you're going to fail. And then you're going to spend multiple minutes just running back to that boss fight, oftentimes to fail again. And there's not even a guarantee you get to that boss fight because the area that you have to run back through is pretty darn tricky. So I will admit that I had some frustration with that particular section of the game, and that was an area where I thought, oh, come on, just add another bench. Just put a bench right outside the boss arena. Is it good? Would it hurt that much to have an extra bench there? Once again, I am spoiled. I'm spoiled by modern amenities that make it so that you get right back into the action that you want to get back into quicker than not. But Silksong, kind of in that particular instance, is more old school because it does away with that particular modern amenity. It's still way more modern than many retro titles that would have basically had you die at a boss and tell you, too bad, so sad, go back to the beginning of the game. So from that perspective, Silksong is great. But I do think there were probably some opportunities to make some of those runbacks just a little bit less long, make it so that you get back to the action that you really want to experience a little bit quicker. Regardless, overall, the difficulty for the game is pretty darn good, and the difficulty ramp as you get from where you start the game to where you eventually end the game is pretty darn natural. There are some spikes there, and there is a very special portion of the game, which once again I will not spoil, but there's a portion of the game where the game world changes dramatically. And I will say that when I first started playing that section of the game, even after playing the game for hours and getting used to everything with the game and having my preferred loadout and knowing how I can navigate different areas and how I can combat different enemies, that section of the game totally wrecked me for a couple hours until I got used to those new mechanics that got introduced with that section of the game. And, well, I mean, eventually I overcame it, and I was able to make that kind of feel not so bad as well, to the point now where I feel like I'm a pretty proficient Silksong player. But when you first encounter that area, it is going to be really challenging. It's going to be very challenging, and even if you felt very comfortable up to that point, you ain't seen nothing yet. Anyway, it's not a horribly difficult game. It is challenging, but it is not something that will make you just totally lose it. As long as you have enough perseverance and attention, you will eventually get through the game. And the cool thing is that getting through the game provides you with such a wonderful sense of exploration and progression that it will feel like a joy to experience. We talked about exploring the game world a little bit earlier, but just the overall act of exploration itself and not knowing what you're going to get when you enter a different area. You might find nothing other than a cool area with neat graphics to explore. That's okay. You might find another area that has a miscellaneous bauble that you can add to your overall inventory that really doesn't do anything mechanically, but is just part of the overall nuance and lore of the game. That's cool too. Or you might find an area that has a super special skill that you need to equip in order to continue playing the game. It is so awesome to walk into a new area and not know what you're going to find. It's also awesome finding secrets. I love finding secrets in games, and Silksong is full of them. Oh my goodness, there are so many secrets. There are so many hidden walls that you need to whack. There's some areas in the game where you just walk off to the side of the screen and you load into a new area. Well, not really load because it's continuous, but you move into a new area and you didn't even realize there was something there. It was kind of like this hidden passage kind of thing. There's so many secrets to uncover, so many wonderful mysteries to see. It is so awesome to explore, and I'm the kind of guy that loves exploring in games. So Silksong feels like the kind of game that was tailor-made for me. And as you're doing that exploration, I got to talk about the visuals. I got to talk about the way the game looks. It looks phenomenal. This was one of the bigger areas of advancement beyond Hollow Knight. Because Hollow Knight, first of all, great game. I loved Hollow Knight. But Hollow Knight, the graphics there, I would never look at Hollow Knight and think, oh yeah, there's a ton of color in that game. It's very gray. Hollow Knight's a very gray game. There are some areas with color in it, which I guess makes the game even a little bit more striking because when color happens in Hollow Knight, it feels impactful. But within Silksong, the overall color palette for the game has been expanded dramatically. There are lush green areas. There are red, fiery areas. There are really cool boss fights with bunches of colors and almost firework displays of colors on the screen. And it feels amazing to visually look at. It looks so good. I mean, it just looks so good. And I really enjoyed just looking at the game. And like I mentioned, there is a certain section of the game where the world goes all topsy-turvy, and I will admit that the visuals during that scene can kind of take a little bit of a grade-over approach, just because that's part of the game at that point that you get to it. I would say that while it still looked good, I prefer the brighter colors. I got used to the brighter colors. I didn't really want the muted colors that would come along with that different section of the game. But regardless, the visuals throughout the entire experience stayed absolutely phenomenal. I loved looking at the game. But not to be outdone, the music. Oh my God. the music. The music in Silksong is ridiculous. That is a soundtrack that as soon as I started playing the game, I knew it was going to be something special. I can't even speak. I knew it was going to be something special as I started playing the game and listening to the music. And the more I dove into the game, the more bosses I encountered, the more locations I found. The music enraptured me. I have listened to that soundtrack outside of game. It is so darn breathtaking. It is a phenomenal soundtrack. The boss music in particular, there are some boss fights that are absolutely epic. And the reason that they're epic beyond the gameplay mechanics is the music. The music is phenomenal. You've heard some pieces throughout this episode as I've been playing them. You have to go out. I could do an entire Sounds of the Classics episode focused just on the Silksong music, and it would never get old. I could listen to that thing repeatedly. The music here is so great. Christopher Larkin did an astounding job. He is so talented, and somehow he made a game with a musical soundtrack even better than Hollow Knight. And Hollow Knight has some really good music. Silksong, from my perspective, exceeds those already high expectations. The music here is phenomenal, and it makes the entire game feel even more epic, especially the boss fights. And let me tell you about the boss fights. Wow. There are so many bosses in this game, and I'm the kind of guy that enjoys games with a lot of bosses. Like Elden Ring, as an example, just trying to challenge myself on all of the different bosses in the game. That's like a favorite pastime of mine. I just love fighting bosses, and especially when they're designed so well and they have epic music accompanying them, it just feels amazing. The bosses in Silksong are all really well designed. Now, I will say, just for awareness, that the first chunk of the game, you're going to be fighting bosses, and there's going to be a couple of standouts, but you're going to be fighting bosses and you're going to think, well, this just feels like a bigger version of an enemy that I might have encountered already. It's fine. It's just not special, let's say. And as I was playing the game, and this is all while this whole difficulty discussion is going on, I'm thinking to myself, well, it's not that bad. I mean, the bosses are kind of mechanically simple. Certainly simpler than what I would prefer. And I had a fear. I had a fear early on playing the game that the bosses were going to be kind of too simple, and that the real challenge was going to be in the overall game world. And oh, by the way, there are these, actually, that's kind of true, because as you explore the game world, I would argue that some of the more difficult encounters are what I would consider or call kind of gauntlet challenges, where you enter an area and a bunch of just normal enemies spawn in waves and they start attacking you, and you have to try to defeat all those waves in order to progress. Those fights are actually oftentimes more difficult than a lot of the bosses that you'll encounter, except for some of the later game bosses, which go absolutely crazy. But a lot of those challenge gauntlet arena kind of things are actually more difficult than some of the bosses you fight. But anyway, back to the bosses. The early bosses didn't feel all that special to me, and I was a little concerned. But then you get to this one fight. I'm not going to tell you what fight because I can't do the spoiler thing, but you get to this fight and you notice it and you think, oh, okay. All right, Team Cherry. This is where you said, now stuff gets real. This is where you really start to feel the overall design of the game. From that point on, which is, I guess I'll say it. It's kind of near the end. It is near the end of Act 1 if you go the normal route to get to Act 2. So at the end of Act 1, you fight this really cool boss. And the mechanics there and the way that it all plays together and the phases of the boss fight, especially mixed in with the music, it created an experience that I thought, okay, I get it. And then pretty much every boss fight from that point on was a level of spectacle and awesomeness that made every other fight in the game pale by comparison. So I guess it was kind of like a way of bringing you up to speed, to almost giving you a sort of tutorial to bosses before the gloves came off and Team Cherry said, all right, you're ready, go. That's what I feel like. I feel like by the end of Act 1, that final boss at the end of Act 1, that is where things get real. And that is where the game just elevates itself to a new level. Because the bosses from that point on, yeah, I am all for it. Now, I do have to mention, and this kind of goes into the difficulty aspect, what I found was that anytime I tried to rush too much because it feels like you do a fair amount of damage. And a lot of the bosses can actually take quite a bit of damage and they don't have a life bar or anything like that. So you don't know exactly how much damage you've done to a boss until they either get staggered or they die. So you don't know how close you are to defeating a boss at any point throughout the boss fight. You could sometimes observe the different phases that they're in to kind of gauge, okay, I'm like a third of the way done or 2/3 of the way done, but there's no real guarantee or indicator of where you are in the overall fight. But what I will say is that with the boss fights in general, it's one of those things where as you fight them, you start to get a feel for their overall mechanics. You get a feel for the patterns that you have to recognize, and then you just go out and you defeat them eventually. But I found every time I tried to rush it because it felt like the boss had too many hit points and I wanted to try to deplete them as quickly as possible, I would often fail. I highly recommend you play this game with patience. Do not try to rush the attack. Take the opportunity to notice the patterns. Take the opportunity to stand in the right spot of the battlefield so that you don't get hit by an attack that is telegraphed, but you might otherwise just think, I'm going to push through it. Do not do that. The game becomes immensely easier when you actually pay attention to the game world and to the mechanics and to the patterns of the enemies that you're fighting. If you can do that, you will emerge victorious. And that victory feels phenomenal. When you eventually beat the game, whether you're going for the traditional ending or any one of several other endings that are included with the game, because yes, there are multiple endings here, some of them are gated behind a lot of additional content. Once you get to that sense of victory, it feels so good. And I will say that I love Silksong. I love everything about it. One of the other things that I like about it, and actually the final thing that we'll talk about for today, but one of the other things I like about it is actually its sense of humor. And there is actually some humor built into Silksong. And the best way I can kind of demonstrate that is by talking about what I'll call the Hornet Slap. This is something that took me by surprise the first time it happened in the game, but it plays itself out multiple times throughout the game, and then every time you see it, it's kind of a comical moment. So there are different parts where you're talking to an NPC or something, and the NPC might be, I'll just give a hypothetical example. Let's say you're talking to a thief, and the thief starts edging closer to you. And you know the thief's going to try to steal something from you. Well, on the screen, the graphics are played out, or the visuals are played out, and the thief starts inching closer to Hornet, and you know he's going to try to steal something. But then out of nowhere, Hornet just goes whoosh, and just like slaps him across the face. And it is the first time it happened. I'm like, oh, that's cool. Hornet's being a little sassy. She's like, no, I'm not going to take any crap from anybody. But then it plays out several times otherwise throughout the game. And I started to laugh because every time you see one of these NPCs start inching closer to Hornet, you know the Hornet slap is coming. And it's actually timed really well comedically, which I didn't expect. So there were certain portions of the game where I saw that Hornet slap to right across the guy's face, and I just started laughing because I'm like, Hornet's such a cool character. Oh yeah, I love Hornet as well. I love all the characters in the game. I love everything about the game. And the simple fact is, with Silksong, I think Team Cherry became, for me, one of my more well-respected and admired development companies in all of gaming. Team Cherry is a company that never lost its cool and continued to stand fast to its own principles, despite people constantly asking them for more details about the game, or deriding them for not releasing their game sooner, or publicly declaring that the game would never come out because Team Cherry would not provide the updates that people wanted to hear. Just like Hornet before unleashing a solid smack to someone approaching her with negative intentions, Team Cherry stood their ground, created the game they wanted to make, released the game when they wanted to release it, and in the process have garnered even more respect and admiration than they enjoyed with their original Hollow Knight release. And personally, I think Team Cherry is an amazing development studio. Now that obviously is because Team Cherry is made up of incredibly talented, but an albeit small team of individuals, and Silksong is a testament to that overall talent. It is by far one of the best games released this year, and has quickly become one of my personal favorite games of all time. Mark your calendars for 20 years from now, because Silksong will undeniably make its way into our pantheon of classic gaming, and there is no doubt in my mind that it will have deserved that spot. Silksong is a truly monumental achievement in gaming, and quite simply, I love Silksong. That was our episode on why I love Silksong. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com. We have our Discord server, and of course, there is always Patreon. Feel free to reach out in any way you like. I will be there. And I will also be there in a couple weeks with our next episode focused on something. We'll figure that something out before we get to that next episode. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. And sometimes our modern games can be truly instant classics. Goodbye, everyone.